The fire sirens were already screaming through the sky by the time I reached the bottom of my driveway. Red light flickered against the clouds like a bad omen. The night air was thick with smoke and panic. And there it was in front of us all. The emergency evacuation gate. Chained. Padlocked. Dead shut. Cars were backed up down the one-lane road, engines idling, families honking and shouting, people out of their vehicles screaming at the gate as flames painted the ridge above in a wicked orange glow. One woman was clutching her baby and yelling for help. Another was banging on the lock with a tire iron. I stood still for a second, watching it all unfold, the chaos, the helplessness, and muttered to myself what everyone was thinking. Karen really did it. She actually locked the evac gate. And the worst part was, I warned her. Just 2 weeks ago, I had been sitting in a folding chair in the HOA's freshly painted community center with a coffee that tasted like cardboard and a headache brewing from the nonsense I was hearing. Karen, the HOA president and self-declared guardian of the neighborhood, stood at the front of the room beside a projector screen that she insisted on using even though no one could read the font size. She had just announced, proudly and with that awful tight smile of hers, that she had padlocked the emergency evacuation gate at the edge of the neighborhood. According to her, there had been reports of dirt bikers using it as a shortcut. In her mind, locking off the only secondary exit route for a neighborhood surrounded by pine and brush was completely logical. To her, unauthorized use of a road justified cutting off hundreds of residents from their only backup way out. I raised my hand, calm and measured, because I had learned the hard way you don't poke the Karen beast without consequences. I explained that the gate was registered with the county as an emergency egress, and closing it was a direct violation of fire safety code. I told her I used to coordinate disaster logistics for a living, had spent years dealing with evac maps and response planning, and that I wasn't speaking out of turn. She didn't even blink. Instead, she flipped through her printout and said, "You're always so negative, Ethan. Not everything needs to be a military operation." The board, a sad group of neighbors too scared or too bored to oppose her, nodded silently. That meeting went from absurd to alarming real fast. Karen unveiled her next plan. A camera installation near the gate and HOA security patrols who would check vehicles entering or exiting. Her tone dripped with power. You could feel it, the way she lit up while wielding control over others. One neighbor, an elderly man named Greg who barely said a word in these meetings, muttered something about fire risk. She shut him down so quickly he recoiled like he'd been slapped. After the meeting, I tried to reason with her privately. I even offered to install a sensor system that would monitor the gate but allow emergency auto-release. I said I'd cover the cost myself. Karen narrowed her eyes and said, "You can keep your military gadgets off our peaceful street. I've seen what happens when people like you get too comfortable. People like me. The vet. The doomsday prepper. The guy who took things too seriously." That's what Karen always said when I tried to fix something the right way. Her problem wasn't the gate. It was control. She wanted to be the queen of her tiny suburban castle, and any sign of logic was a threat to her rule. A few days after that meeting, I noticed the first HOA warning stuck to my front door. Apparently, my truck violated visual harmony because it had a winch mounted on the front. Then they fined me for non-standard fencing materials on my backyard chicken enclosure. That same week, a neighbor told me she'd seen a couple of the HOA volunteers walking up and down the road photographing my yard. I had one of the safest, cleanest properties in the area, but Karen had made me her enemy. Still, I kept pushing. I filed a report with the county fire marshal, citing the illegal lock. I forwarded photos. They said they'd investigate, but nothing happened. Karen was clever. She labeled the padlock a temporary nuisance control measure and claimed the main road was sufficient for evacuation. When I tried to cut the lock myself one morning during a safety drill, Karen called the sheriff. They showed up, confused, half laughing, but technically had to let her file a complaint for property damage. I wasn't arrested, but it was enough of a message. She had power, and she was willing to use it. I told myself I'd seen worse. That I'd lived through deployments, earthquakes, and storms. That dealing with a tyrant in capris and sun visor sunglasses wasn't going to break me. But the truth was, Karen had boxed us all in. And deep down, I knew what was coming. It was only a matter of time before nature tested her authority. It came faster than I expected. The fire season hit early that year. Dry lightning sparked a blaze 20 miles out, and by the time it was 10 miles away, the wind had shifted and emergency alerts were being pushed out on every device in the state. Our neighborhood was in the red zone. Everyone who lived near the north perimeter, my family included, knew the main road was too exposed. If the fire jumped the ridge, the evac gate was the only way out. But when the alert came through and we all rushed to that gate, we found steel, rust, and a fat lock Karen had bragged about ordering custom reinforced. It was holding. People were pounding the metal, some crying, some screaming. A couple of younger residents tried climbing the fence but gave up. My own teenage son looked at me, eyes wide with fear, asking what we were going to do. That was when I knew I couldn't wait on the county, or the fire department, or any phone call. I told him to get his mom, grab the dogs, and drive back to the barn. I'd handle the rest. I turned around, walked back through the smoke, and headed straight for the one tool Karen forgot I had. She didn't know about the project I'd been restoring in my off hours. The gift I'd won in a military charity auction 5 years ago. She thought I was bluffing. She thought I'd never go that far. Karen forgot I owned a tank. And tonight, she was about to remember. 2 weeks before the night the fire came down the hill like a freight train, I had already been knee-deep in a war with Karen, and it wasn't the kind that left physical scars. It was the kind that exhausted your soul. After that now infamous HOA meeting, I became enemy number 1 in her eyes, and she wasted no time showing it. Every morning I'd find a fresh little envelope tucked under my welcome mat or taped to my fence, courtesy of Karen and her clipboard brigade. Violation: unapproved tool shed color. Warning: excessive utility equipment in driveway. Notice: surveillance cameras must be approved. Each note was signed in that same squiggly cursive that somehow managed to look both cheerful and menacing at the same time. She was a master of weaponizing the rulebook, bending the HOA bylaws into something that suited her personal vendettas. The ironic part was that the rest of the neighborhood wasn't made up of radicals or rule breakers. Most people here were retirees, young families, or like me, working folks just trying to keep their property in good shape. No one wanted drama. But Karen didn't thrive on peace. She needed friction to feel in charge. Her little fines and veiled threats weren't about keeping order. They were about control. After she locked the evac gate, people began whispering, but they didn't act. Fear has a funny way of freezing a person. No one wanted to be next on her target list. That's when I started digging. I didn't want to just be the guy complaining at the meetings. I wanted to build a case so airtight that even Karen's cronies couldn't ignore it. I pulled up every county regulation about emergency access, printed out the HOA's own charter, and even requested email records through a neighbor who worked in civil affairs. What I found was even worse than I expected. Not only had Karen installed the lock without any vote, she had also used HOA funds to pay a private contractor to weld a metal plate over the old fire department access box, which meant even first responders couldn't open the gate without bolt cutters. She buried this in vague budget entries labeled Gate Security Enhancements. I brought this information to the next board meeting, fully expecting outrage. I presented it calmly, with documentation and highlighted note. The room was packed for once, word had spread, and people were curious. Karen sat at the head of the table, looking smug with her stack of index cards. When I finished, she didn't even blink. She tapped her papers and said, "Ethan, we appreciate your concerns, but safety decisions fall under the board's discretion. The gate is secure, and that's final." A few people clapped nervously, mostly her loyalists. I saw Greg again, The older man who had voiced concerns before started to raise his hand, but she moved right past him. After the meeting, I caught her in the parking lot and tried one last time. I didn't yell. I didn't threaten. I just said, "Karen, if anything happens and that gate's still locked, people could die. Do you understand that?" She put on her sunglasses, looked down her nose at me, and replied, "If anything happens, the fire department will take care of it. We don't need neighborhood vigilantes pretending they're heroes." She got in her car and drove off without another word. That was the moment I knew I couldn't rely on anyone inside the system to help. The HOA was too far gone. Karen had spun her web, and most folks were just trying to avoid getting caught in it. But I wasn't wired that way. I had spent years planning for disasters, and I wasn't going to stand by and let one happen in slow motion while some egomaniac played politics with people's lives. So I started planning too, but in a different way. Not to fight her head-on anymore. That was useless. I began preparing for the moment she couldn't ignore. That's when I reached out to my old friend Darnell, a former Marine who now ran a restoration business for military vehicles. Years ago, I had bought a decommissioned M60 Patton tank through a veteran auction, mostly as a passion project. It wasn't operational in any combat sense. The weapon systems were gutted, but the engine, treads, and core systems were still functional. I'd kept it on Darnell's land about 10 miles out, working on it slowly over weekends. When I told Darnell what was going on, he laughed until he realized I was serious. I didn't say I'd drive it into battle. I just said I might need a powerful visual reminder for people who had forgotten what emergencies looked like. Together we ran a systems check, did light maintenance, and prepped the trailer to move it if needed. I hoped it would never come to that. I honestly did. But something deep in my gut told me it would. Back in the neighborhood, things only got worse. Karen escalated her campaign against me. One afternoon, a county code enforcement truck pulled into my driveway. The officer said he'd received an anonymous tip about illegal land use. He inspected my chicken coop, my solar array, and even my rainwater tank. I passed every single check, but the message was clear. Karen was willing to use government resources like pawns. That night, my motion sensor cameras caught someone in a hoodie pulling the batteries from one of the security lights on my fence. Nothing was stolen. It wasn't a break-in. It was intimidation. I started talking to neighbors more directly. Over coffee. While walking dogs. I didn't try to rally a rebellion, I just laid out the facts. Most of them had kids or aging parents. I showed them the fire map, the slope of the hill, the wind patterns. I asked, "If the main road's blocked, what's our plan?" The more I talked, the more heads nodded. A few of them quietly admitted they'd seen Karen brag about the lock on social media. One woman even showed me a post where Karen called herself the gatekeeper of sanity. The real shift happened when a small fire broke out just 8 miles away and burned through 2 acres before it was contained. The air smelled like smoke for a day and people got nervous. Karen held a special emergency meeting, insisting everything was under control. She said the fire was handled and that we should trust the board to do what's right. But the nerves were there now. People started taking a closer look at their escape plans, and that padlocked gate became a symbol of just how little power they really had when things got real. That week, I sent another formal letter to the fire marshal, this time with photographic evidence of the welded access box. I copied 3 local reporters and a state representative. The same day, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to see where the HOA funds had gone. Karen had poked the wrong bear, and I wasn't going to stop until someone else saw what I saw, that her power trip wasn't just annoying anymore. It was dangerous. The morning of the fire, I was already uneasy. The heat was intense, the wind dry and erratic. I did a walkthrough of my property, checked my emergency supplies, and made sure our go-bags were ready. By noon, the alert buzzed on my phone. Wildfire reported in the Western Valley, 70% uncontained. Evacuation routes may be needed. I looked up at the sky. The sun was red through the haze. An hour later, it all came crashing down. We were told to evacuate immediately. I saw neighbors pouring out into the streets, kids barefoot, dogs barking, people shoving last-minute items into their cars. My wife grabbed our bags while I double-checked the water barrels and closed off the gas lines. We got in the truck and joined the convoy heading to the evac gate. And that's when it happened. We turned the corner and saw the backup. The panic. The smoke curling like fingers around the treetop. And the gate chained. Just like I feared. No bolt cutter. No release switch. No emergency crew in sight. People started shouting. One woman ran to the front yelling for someone to call 911 again. My son looked at me, trying not to cry. And I did what I had trained my whole life to do. I told my wife, take the back road. Get to Darnell's. Tell him it's go time. I stepped out of the truck, tightened my boots, and walked away through the smoke, knowing full well what I had to do next. Karen had played queen for long enough. Now it was time for the cavalry. And this time it came with treads. The moment I stepped into the barn and saw the tank sitting there under the tarp, something deep inside me shifted. Not out of anger, not even revenge. It was pure, calculated urgency. This wasn't about proving Karen wrong anymore. This was about getting people out alive. The air inside the barn was already thick with smoke and heat, even miles from the fire. The wind had shifted. Ash floated down like gray snow outside the doors, and the orange sky was darkening by the minute. I pulled the tarp back in one swift motion, revealing the dull green bulk of the M60, its surface still dusted from months of storage. She was massive, powerful, and exactly what I needed. I didn't have time for doubt. I climbed up, unlocked the hatch, and slipped inside like I'd done 100 times before during my years restoring it. The controls weren't exactly smooth, but I knew what needed to happen. She wasn't built for speed, but she was unstoppable in a straight line. That was all I required. I radioed Darnell just once. Tanks going live. Fire evac. You know what to do. His reply came through quick. Godspeed, brother. Let it rip. I cranked the engine. It coughed, choked, and then roared to life, rattling the walls of the barn. The vibrations went through my bones. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't legal in most senses. But it was necessary. I guided her out of the barn with steady hands, moving like a steel beast awakened from slumber. I hit the road slow and steady, the weight of the tank pressing into the cracked asphalt as I rolled past rows of startled cattle and abandoned pickup trucks. Smoke was sweeping in now, heavier, denser. In the distance I could hear sirens and shouting. Somewhere along the way, a news helicopter buzzed overhead, probably drawn by the trail of ash and, now, the moving tank in the middle of a two-lane country road. My phone buzzed from the passenger seat where I'd tossed it, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. When I got back to the neighborhood edge, people were still trapped at the evac gate, now completely surrounded by smoke. Some were banging on the metal frame with garden tools. A few were sitting on the pavement coughing, covering their faces with shirts. Kids were crying in backseat. I rolled the tank to the top of the hill where the road curved down to the gate and stopped for a second. No one noticed me yet. The roar of the engine had blended in with the chaos. I climbed out of the top hatch and waved both arms. That's when the heads started to turn. At first, there was confusion, then recognition, then cheers. People parted like I was parting a sea. I rolled the tank down slowly, people stepping aside with stunned expressions. A few shouted things I couldn't hear clearly. One guy took out his phone and started filming. The woman with the baby sobbed, holding her child tight to her chest. The chain on the gate rattled slightly as wind pushed against it, but it held strong. So I parked directly in front of it, stepped down onto the gravel, and inspected it one last time. It was a thick steel padlock, reinforced and bolted to the side gate frame. Not coming off with anything short of power tools or a miracle. But that was fine. I didn't bring a wrench. I brought 20 tons of American steel. I got back into the tank, shifted gears, and backed up about 15 feet. I looked through the narrow slit of the viewport and took a breath. The people behind me watched in silence. It was surreal. Smoke rising, sirens fading, children whimpering, and the looming sound of fire crackling in the distance. Then I hit the throttle. The tank lunged forward with a guttural growl, treads tearing into the earth, and in less than 3 seconds, it slammed into the gate. Metal screeched. The padlock shattered like brittle candy under the pressure. The gate folded inward and crashed down, opening the access road beyond. For a moment, there was no sound at all, just wind and smoke. Then someone shouted, "It's open! Move!" And just like that, the exodus began. Cars peeled out one by one, tires screeching on gravel. People cried with relief, windows down, honking wildly as they passed me. Some waved. One guy in a Jeep shouted, "You're a damn legend." I stayed by the opening until the last vehicle made it through, an old Dodge with 2 golden retrievers and an elderly couple inside. The man saluted me as he rolled by. I nodded back and watched them go. I didn't leave immediately. I had to make sure everyone was gone. Then I rolled the tank to the side of the road and powered it down, letting the silence settle around me. I stood on top of it and looked back toward the neighborhood. The fire was still distant but creeping closer. The evacuation had worked. The gate was destroyed. And the message was loud and clear. It didn't take long before Karen arrived. Her white SUV screeched to a halt behind a few remaining cars. She jumped out in high heels, wearing a wide-brimmed sun hat and a designer cardigan, completely out of place in the apocalypse unfolding around her. Her face was flushed with fury, not fear. She stormed up the road like a soap opera villain, pointing wildly at the tank and screaming, "You're finished! You've destroyed HOA property. I'm pressing charges." I didn't respond at first. She climbed halfway onto the wrecked gate and shouted, "You are going to jail for this. Do you know what you've done?" That's when a firefighter truck finally arrived, blaring through the smoke. The crew jumped out, looked at the destroyed gate, looked at me, and then looked at Karen. "Who locked this gate?" the fire captain barked, face blackened with soot. Karen turned to him and replied, "It was a precaution. People were trespassing." He cut her off. "You padlocked a designated emergency egress? During fire season?" She froze, suddenly aware she wasn't the one with the most authority anymore. The captain gestured toward the tank. "Who opened it?" I raised my hand slightly. He looked at the gate again, then back at me. "Good. You probably saved half this neighborhood." He walked off without waiting for a reply. Karen sputtered, trying to get the attention of a young cop who had just arrived. Officer, arrest him. He's a vigilante. He used a military vehicle to damage private property." The officer walked over, looked me up and down, then said flatly, "Ma'am, it's not illegal to use your own legally owned vehicle during an emergency. Especially when you've created a public safety hazard." She shrieked. Loudly. The kind of shriek that cracks glass. But nobody backed her up. Not a single person. In fact, one of the neighbors who had quietly suffered under her reign stepped forward and shouted. She ignored the fire codes. He warned her. Others began chiming in. A chorus of angry, smoke-choked voices. Someone yelled, "We could have died." And suddenly, the weight of what she'd done was crashing down on her like a second wall of fire. Karen tried to scream over them, but the crowd was louder. People pulled out their phones. A woman live-streamed the entire scene to social media. The fire crews confirmed the gate had been obstructed in violation of emergency access code. They took photos, interviewed witnesses, and contacted the county safety office. Karen tried to flee but was stopped by a sheriff's deputy. They didn't arrest her. Not yet, but they handed her a citation and told her she'd be under investigation. As for me, I stayed behind. Helped the last few stragglers. Directed traffic down the cleared road. Even helped a woman load her cat carriers into a van. It wasn't about heroics. It was about doing what needed to be done when everyone else was too afraid or too distracted to do it. My tank sat on the edge of the fire line like a monument to stubborn resolve. And though I hadn't planned to be the man who broke through a gate with a literal war machine, sometimes life forces your hand. Later that night, long after the fire was finally contained and the last of the embers cooled, I returned to my home. The gate was gone. Karen's power was fading. And deep down, I knew the real fight was just beginning. Because now the world had seen the truth. And Karen? She had no gate left to hide behind. By the next morning, the videos had already gone viral. My phone buzzed nonstop. Clips of the tank rolling down the road, the gate getting flattened, Karen screaming like a banshee. Every angle had been caught. Someone had even overlaid dramatic music, calling it Tank Man vs. HOA Karen. It was spreading like wildfire, pun fully intended. Local news picked it up by noon, and by evening, national outlets had started calling. They were desperate for interviews. Apparently, in a world full of petty neighborhood disputes and HOA power trips, this one had everything: fire, drama, a literal tank, and one very angry Karen getting publicly shamed. I wasn't interested in being famous. I didn't want to be anyone's internet hero. But I knew this attention was more than just noise. It was leverage. And Karen? She had lost control of the narrative. She tried, of course. She put out a Facebook statement on the HOA page claiming I had endangered lives, that the gate was only ever meant to be locked temporarily, and that I was a militant extremist. But that excuse didn't land when the fire chief himself went on the record and said, that man's actions directly prevented a mass casualty event. Had the gate remained locked another 15 minutes, we would have been dragging bodies out. That quote was picked up everywhere. Karen deleted her statement shortly after, but screenshots had already spread. People began digging into the HOA records, and that's when things really began unraveling. A neighbor named Allison, who worked for a non-profit law group, quietly compiled documents and flagged financial inconsistencies in the HOA's spending report. She sent them to the county attorney and CC'd me on the email. Karen had been charging the HOA for security services that didn't exist and listing Amazon purchases under vague entries like neighborhood beautification. One of those items turned out to be a custom padlock. Another was a wireless camera she installed near my driveway without telling anyone. The fallout began quickly. First, Karen's inner circle crumbled. The treasurer quit, citing ethical concerns. Then 2 board members resigned after being publicly questioned about the gate lock. One neighbor wrote an open letter demanding Karen's resignation, and dozens of others signed it. The HOA called an emergency meeting to address the growing unrest. I showed up just to watch it unfold, and it was nothing short of a meltdown. The room was packed wall to wall. People stood in the back, holding copies of fines they had received under Karen's leadership. One woman clutched a binder 2 inches thick full of violations. When Karen walked in, wearing her usual pastel blazer and trying to act composed, someone in the back muttered, "Here comes the Queen." She tried to open the meeting with her usual strict tone, but the crowd didn't let her speak. Hands shot up. Voices rose. A man named Carl stood and shouted, "You almost got my family killed because of a dirt bike." That broke the dam. People spoke for nearly 2 hours. Stories poured out, how Karen had stalked their social media accounts, fined them for Christmas decorations, even tried to force a widow to remove a memorial bench in her garden. All of it aired in front of news cameras and streaming phones. When it was my turn, I didn't gloat. I walked to the front, held up the gate lock, and simply said, "This almost cost us everything." I warned her. She laughed. I didn't do this to win. I did this because I had no other option. The room erupted in applause. Karen's composure cracked. She tried to pivot, claiming she was being unfairly targeted. She accused me of orchestrating a witch hunt. She called the video edited propaganda. But it was too late. The truth was out, and the people who had once cowered under her rule were no longer afraid. A vote was held that night to suspend her authority pending investigation. 93% voted in favor. Karen stormed out, tears running down her cheeks, shouting something about lawyers and "you'll regret this." I didn't regret a single thing. The next few days were a whirlwind. A local veterans group reached out and asked if I'd speak at their fire preparedness fundraiser. I agreed, hoping to shift the conversation from tank videos to actual safety. A documentary crew came by wanting to film a segment. I politely declined but told them to interview the neighbors who really mattered. One of them was Greg, the quiet man who had first questioned Karen's plan. Turned out, he was a retired firefighter. He gave a powerful interview about how close we came to disaster. When asked about me, he simply said, "Ethan did what any real leader would do. He acted." The county board stepped in next. A formal inquiry into the HOA's practices was opened. Karen was subpoenaed to provide full financial disclosures and explain the misuse of community funds. The fire marshal issued a public statement clarifying the gate had been unlawfully modified and that emergency routes were not subject to HOA discretion. That one line alone made headlines across homeowner forums and legal blogs. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just facing local outrage. She was the face of everything wrong with unchecked HOA power. She tried one last trick. A lawsuit. She filed against me for property destruction, claiming the tank had damaged HOA infrastructure and that my actions were reckless. She even tried to sue the fire department for defamation. But the county attorney responded with a countersuit for public endangerment, obstruction of emergency services, and fraudulent misrepresentation. Her lawyer quit 2 days later. What she hadn't realized was that several of us had already documented every conversation, every meeting, every warning we'd issued her. The lawsuit collapsed before it even reached court. The judge threw it out and ordered her to cover legal fees. Karen disappeared from public view after that. Her house went dark. Rumors swirled that she had moved in with her sister in another state. Someone saw a U-Haul in her driveway one night, and the next morning, the security cameras she'd installed all over the neighborhood were gone. In her absence, the HOA restructured. A special election was held. I was nominated to lead the newly created Emergency Preparedness and Safety Committee. I agreed on one condition: we dismantle the current fining structure and rebuild it with community votes, not dictatorship. The proposal passed unanimously. The gate was rebuilt with a new auto-release system linked to emergency services. Volunteers trained in evacuation drills. Fire breaks were reinforced. We partnered with local firefighters for seasonal safety audit. And the tank? Well, it got its own spot in the neighborhood park. Not as a weapon, not as a warning, but as a monument. Kids painted it in bright colors, added handprints, even wrote, "Thank you, Mr. E" across the turret in chalk. It became a symbol of what we stood for. Not war, but readiness and standing up for what's right when it matters most. I stood next to it one afternoon, watching the sunset and sipping lemonade. A boy biked up, pointed at the tank, and asked, "Is it true you smashed through the gate to save everybody?" I smiled and said, "It's true, we all got out. That's what matters." He grinned and sped off down the path. And that was the strange thing. In all the chaos and heat, the drama and shouting, the lawsuits and locks, what remained was community. Karen had ruled through fear. But once we remembered our strength was in each other, her power vanished like smoke in the wind. What she built with threats, we replaced with trust. What she locked, we opened for everyone. And maybe, just maybe, that tank didn't just break a gate. Maybe it broke a cycle. It was strange how quickly things changed after the fire, not just in the physical sense but in the way people moved, talked, and interacted with one another. Before, neighbors barely looked up when passing on the sidewalk. Most interactions were filtered through complaint forms, sarcastic Facebook comments, or whispered gossip. But now, people waved. They talked. They offered each other help with fences, lawn repairs, even groceries. It wasn't perfect, but the fear that had hung over the community like an invisible chain, Karen's chain, was gone. What replaced it was something raw and human, born out of shared trauma and a narrowly avoided tragedy. For weeks after the fire, I found myself busier than ever. Not because I had to be, but because people finally wanted to do things right. I helped install motion sensor lights along the walking trail and assisted Greg with drafting a community evacuation plan, one that actually complied with county regulations. Allison and her legal team helped write a new HOA charter that included mandatory transparency, term limits, and a clause that allowed immediate removal of any board member who endangered public safety. We posted it online, held a vote, and passed it with overwhelming support. For the first time in years, there was no yelling at the meetings. No eye rolls. No petty fines. Just neighbors working toward a future that didn't feel like a boot on their neck. Karen was gone. No one knew where exactly. Her house was eventually sold to a young couple with 2 golden retrievers and a daughter who loved playing in the tank park. She never made a public apology, never admitted wrongdoing. She simply vanished, her voice disappearing from the emails and bulletin boards like she had never existed. But the damage she left behind lingered, not just in the documents or lawsuits, but in the way we had to rebuild trust, not just with each other, but in the systems we had allowed to go unchecked for so long. The tank, for its part, became something of a legend. The story reached further than I ever expected. National news ran a Sunday special on the tank that freed a neighborhood. A veterans organization invited me to speak at their conference, and a California fire department even asked if they could send a team to tour our neighborhood's new emergency response layout. I didn't mind the attention, though I turned down most interview requests. I didn't want fame. I wanted something Karen never understood: peace. Still, I agreed to one segment for a local news station. They asked me why I did it. I told them the truth. When systems fail, I said, you have 2 options. You wait and hope someone comes to help. Or you step up and become the help. The reporter smiled like it was a catchy quote, but I wasn't trying to be catchy. I was just tired of watching people be powerless in their own communities. A few months after the fire, the governor's office reached out. Apparently, someone had sent them the footage, the articles, and the after-action reports. They were organizing a regional recognition ceremony for civilians who had played a role in wildfire response. I was invited to speak, though I almost declined. Public speaking wasn't my thing anymore. But my wife nudged me, said it would mean something to the community, especially the kids who looked up to what had happened. The event was modest but respectful. They held it on the lawn of the state capitol, rows of chairs under a sky that had finally cleared after a long summer of smoke and sirens. I stood beside fire chiefs, dispatchers, helicopter pilots, and volunteer coordinators, real heroes in every sense. When it was my turn, I didn't say much. I talked about the danger of ignoring warnings, the importance of neighborhood unity, and how quickly a gate meant to protect became a symbol of danger. I didn't mention Karen by name. I didn't have to. Everyone already knew the story. The crowd applauded, not with wild cheers but with quiet appreciation, the kind that matters more than internet likes ever could. After the ceremony, the governor handed me a plaque, "For Civilian Valor in the Face of Wildfire." I held it for a second, then handed it to my son who stood beside me. He smiled and whispered, "You're famous now, Dad." I laughed and said, "I was already famous." Karen made sure of that. Back home, the days settled into a rhythm again. The neighborhood took on a new rhythm too. We held our first community barbecue in years, and over 50 families showed up. People brought casseroles, lemonade, folding chairs, even a bouncy house. Kids climbed all over the tank, now freshly painted in community mural colors. Greg manned the grill, wearing an apron that read "Gatebreaker Chef." Someone even made t-shirts that said "Evacuate like Ethan" in big block letters. It was silly, sure, but it meant something. A neighborhood that once whispered now laughed out loud. But the funniest twist of all came one morning, months later, when I checked the mail and found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single typed note, Congratulations on your little rebellion. I'm watching. That was it. No name. No signature. Just that. At first I thought it was a joke, maybe someone trying to poke fun. But my gut told me otherwise. Karen was still out there, somewhere, still simmering. Still bitter. Probably still convinced she had been right. But it didn't matter. She couldn't touch us anymore. The community she once ruled with passive-aggressive tyranny had evolved beyond her reach. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset over the charred hill that had once threatened our lives, I thought about how close we had come to disaster. About what it took to stop it. Not just a tank. Not just me. But everyone who finally stood up and said enough. We had faced fire, fear, and a woman who believed authority was the same as righteousness. And we had won. My wife came out with 2 lemonades and handed me one. We sat in silence for a while, the good kind, the kind that says everything without a word. Eventually she asked, "Do you think anyone would have stopped her if you hadn't done what you did?" I didn't answer right away. I just looked at the gate in the distance, now reinforced, open, and protected by the systems we built together. Then I said, maybe. But I didn't want to bet their lives on a maybe. And that's what it came down to. Not rebellion. Not revenge. Responsibility. Karen had tried to lock people in, to control them, to put her ego above their lives. But in the end, all she really did was teach us how important it is to stand up before the fire comes. How necessary it is to break the gate when it keeps us from saving each other. The tank remained. Not a weapon, but a reminder. And the people? They were no longer afraid. They were ready. And for the first time in a long time, so was I.